everyone, welcome to today's chat, and I'm going to talk to you about something called zonulin. Now, zonulin is, I would call, the gatekeeper for our gut. I know it sounds like an alien planet or a character from Star Trek, but it's an amazing protein, and it's a fundamental part of gut health, although it's also found elsewhere in the body. So I thought, because I needed to think of something that began with Z, I thought I would introduce zonulin to you. So just to recap, our gut is basically one long tube, and our intestines are about 8 to 9 meters in length. And our intestines are our gut is a really important part of our immune system, but our intestines in particular, because of the way that it allows what we get from our environment actually into our body. It's really a place where our outside environment meets up with our inside environment, and that particularly happens in our small intestine. So one of the most important factors is the structure of our small intestine, which has these tightly packed single layers of cells that interact and negotiate what is allowed across into them and then through them and into our bloodstream. So they actually act as a barrier to the outside world, to our inside world. And actually really important, because that's where we get our nutrients from. So you can imagine a tunnel, and along the walls of the tunnel are these doors. And if you were in a taxi and you kind of got out of the taxi and you knocked on one of the doors, then a decision would be made as to whether you would be let in through the door into the tunnel or not. And that's what we call intestinal permeability. It's the decision about whether something can or cannot cross our intestinal barrier. And basically those decisions are whether you're a friend, you're a nutrient from the food we eat, or you are foe, pollutant or bug. And of course, in reality, it's far more complex than that, but it's, to simplify it, you have this barrier. And we also, on top of that, have mucus, which is that lovely slimy stuff, which is really important part of our immune system in our gut. And we have immune cells that also police the border too. So there's a lot going on. Now, the doors in our tunnels are what we would call tight junctions, and they open and they allow nutrients in or out, and they keep out the riffraff, the bugs or the pollutants or the whatever the things that might cause inflammation in our body. And you may have heard the term leaky gut, which refers to these tight junctions opening permanently, really. So we actually don't have a leaky gut. We don't have a gut that constantly drips or leaks. It doesn't really work like that. It's a much more dynamic function that happens, and it's also a natural phenomenon. The tight junctions are meant to open and close all the time. The technical term is intestinal hyperpermeability, or intestinal permeability is the natural phenomenon. Hyperpermeability means that it's allowing probably more stuff in than it should. Now, they're meant to open and close all the time. They open when we're stressed to ensure we have more nutrients, or certain foods and drinks will also open or close them. And babies in particular are meant to have that leaky gut, so they can absorb all of the good stuff from breast milk that would otherwise be too large for them to just cross into the bloodstream from the gut naturally. Now, zonulin was discovered in 1993. It's a protein. I know you were wondering when I was going to start talking about zonulin. But it was found to be a key modulator to this opening and closing of these tight junctions, these kind of doorways in our gut. And whilst there's still a lot we don't know about leaky gut or intestinal permeability, there does seem to be an association with an increased intestinal hyperpermeability and chronic disease. And not all chronic diseases are linked to that gut permeability, but it does seem to be there when there's a lot of inflammation. And that inflammation drives disease, particularly in regards to lung disease and COVID-19 as well. There's a big link between the gut and that. So what we do know is that high levels of zonulin increase these tight junctions opening and closing. Imagine those doors not quite closed. It's a bit like one of those swing gates that kind of swings open and would automatically go back in place. Maybe it doesn't quite go back the way it should, and thereby increases that intestinal permeability of the gut lining and allowing things across that perhaps shouldn't come across. Now, why does that matter? Well, because if the intestinal lining is too permeable and it's allowing things that really shouldn't be getting across. There are things like toxins and pollutants, bugs like viruses and bacteria, something in particular called LPS, which I know I've talked about before, lipopolysaccharide. It's a fat, sugary substance that's found on the wall of specific bacteria, gram-negative bacteria, and that's hugely associated with inflammation. So they basically pass through and enter into the bloodstream and cause havoc in our bodies, and they shouldn't ordinarily be there. So whilst many things can create this intestinal hyperpermeability, such as medications like ibuprofen or other inflammatory chemicals that can cause damage, like interleukin-13 and tumor necrosis factor, zonulin is really a protein that's the gatekeeper and is responsible for opening and closing. Now, like most things, Goldilocks is the key. You don't want too much and you don't want too little. And there appears to be two things in particular that increase zonulin in some people. There are other things as well, but these are two big ones. So first of all, bacteria. We know that infections like Salmonella and Candida, which is actually a yeast, they can increase zonulin, and that's we know they cause disease, they cause inflammation, and then that can cause problems. But it also, it might be a defense mechanism whereby the zonulin is increasing because it's a kind of a stressor, and it might be that it's actually trying to manage the bacteria rather than cause problems, but we don't actually know. We know that dysbiosis, which is an imbalance in gut microbiota, can trigger an increase in zonulin. And over time, if you have this dysbiosis which continues, that can actually lead to inflammation, which then can actually exacerbate that hyperpermeability, and then you end up with a vicious cycle. And then the other thing is gluten, and this has mainly been found in people with celiac disease. The research in healthy adults or people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity had really differing results. So there's probably more there that we don't understand, but we do know that gluten increases zonulin, but may only be a problem if gluten itself is damaging the gut and creating inflammation, and that then that's where the problem is. So it's not necessarily zonulin that's the problem. The zonulin is opening and closing and deciding whether it opens or closes. It's usually the inflammation or infection or other things that's actually increasing the zonulin that's causing the problem. So some of the things increase zonulin, like certain herbs, hops, will increase zonulin, thereby open those gates. Sugar, coconut oil, dairy, and as I said, stress will do that. And that's a natural phenomenon in order for us to get more nutrients in, but chronic stress can then mean that maybe other things get in that shouldn't. Alcohol, and as I said, inflammation is one of the biggest things, because inflammation means that it's damaging the gut lining, and that is why those tight junctions aren't kind of tightening up naturally as they are meant to. So to be clear, having a leaky gut or having this intestinal permeability is a natural thing. It's dynamic. Those tight junctions or doorways are continuously opening and closing to allow food into our bloodstream. And certain foods and stress will influence this. So for example, alcohol will open up those tight junctions, and the polyphenols, which are the kind of the colored part of the grape, they're a plant nutrient that's found in wine, actually closes them. So you've got a drink that's actually opening and closing, and thereby probably creating some kind of balance. The problem is when there is severe chronic inflammation or injury to the gut lining, and then those tight junctions don't really tighten up properly, and then you have a problem. You could test for zonulin. I know in the past when we first found out about zonulin, it was kind of suggested it got tested, but I'm not entirely sure how valuable that is, because if there are high amounts of zonulin, it doesn't necessarily mean that's a marker for intestinal hyperpermeability or that leaky gut. It doesn't test, it's not a test for inflammation. And zonulin kind of increases and decreases continuously dependent on the diet that you have. So it's probably better to actually get other tests done for leaky gut, or to actually test for inflammatory markers. I mean, testing for LPS would be a lot more useful, because that shouldn't be in our bloodstream. So my tips would be, number one, prevent infection as much as you can. Prevent or treat inflammation in the gut or any injury to the gut lining, and do that in the first place, because that's actually the thing that's going to cause problems. prevent or treat dysbiosis, because that will increase zonulin, but again, that dysbiosis can create damage to the gut and we don't want that. And then also consider removing gluten, and or I would address other food intolerances, because if you have food intolerances, then again, you're going to create inflammation to the gut. And then when zonulin does increase with the diet that you eat, you're actually over time going to create that leaky gut and those problems. So number one, eating fiber and prebiotic rich foods are really important. So that's lots of vegetables, eating veggies with color, eating a variety of vegetables, having a handful of berries or colorful fruit every day, eating fermented foods, things like kimchi, sauerkraut, kefir, pickled veggies, kombucha, yogurt, miso, tempeh, sourdough bread if you can tolerate that, a little cheese if you can tolerate that, or consider taking a probiotic supplement. There's been studies to show that when you have fermented foods or you take a probiotic in the long term, you actually see far more benefit. Mediterranean type diet would be ideal. So these are, whole foods where possible, olive oil and healthy fats, lots of vegetables and fruit, having a little bit of meat on the side, handfuls of nuts and seeds, legumes and lentils, and herbs and spices are really important for a healthy gut. And you're going to get that mix of increasing and reducing zonulin in a healthy way. Try gluten-free grains instead. If you have celiac disease, then take it seriously. Don't eat gluten-containing foods, even if you don't have symptoms. I've seen it before where people have been diagnosed with celiacs, but they go, well, I don't have any symptoms, so I have some now and again. You might not be able to see the damage that it's doing. So please, if you are celiac, do not have gluten, because down the line you might end up really suffering consequences for that. So please don't eat gluten, and try non-gluten or gluten-free grains if you do have a problem with gluten, and see if that helps too. Make sure you drink enough water during the day. Dehydration can certainly play a role in inflammation too. Vitamins A and D and zinc, really, really important for a healthy gut as well. And deficiencies have been found to actually exacerbate increased hyperpermeability. And find ways to manage stress, because we know that chronic stress increases zonulin, and over time that can cause problems. So if you're female, it's even more important the second half of your cycle, when cortisol increases naturally. So you've already got that heightened stress response in your body. If you then add layers of stress from the outside world and from your thoughts, then again, it can exacerbate that leaky gut. So I hope that's been interesting. If you go to my blog on my website, you can read all the references. Have a fantastic day and take care. Support the zonulin, help it be the gatekeeper that it needs, and help protect your gut from the inflammation and infection and damage that can then lead to that intestinal hyperpermeability, which you don't want, because that can then drive chronic inflammatory diseases elsewhere in the body. Have a fantastic day. I will see you all soon.